So I have a confession to make. I am hopelessly in love with the idea of world peace. So much so that I dream about it. Would you dare to dream with me this evening? Can you close your eyes for just one moment? Imagine falling asleep in the comfort of your very own home, not having to worry about your safety and security outside of these four walls. Imagine waking up to a whole new world, a new fantastic point of view. A world free from war, hatred, genocide, and poverty. A world where justice is judicious, empathy is endemic, and love is loyal, long-lasting, and liberating. This is the world that I dream of. What does this world look like? What does it taste like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? And what does it smell like? Smells like teen spirit. Now that we've envisioned this utopian human experience, open your eyes. Now you may ask, what can we do to get to this place? That's a wonderful question. I'm glad that you asked. Vision is the vehicle, my friend. Vision is the act or power of sensing that which will or may come to be, not to be confused with the act or power of sensing with the eyes. The vision that I'm speaking of requires no sight. The vision that I'm speaking of does three things, but also requires three things of the visionary. The first thing that vision does is vision creates humility by requiring patience. In my short yet full lifetime, I've come to understand that you can't change the world by starting with the world. One of the largest challenges with traditional leadership and vision is that we are often tasked with changing our communities, our countries, and our world before we begin the most important work on ourselves. Vision and social change are much like values and beliefs. It begins at home. I remember the moment when it finally sunk in that I couldn't change the world by myself. I was a music education student who was eager to enter the classroom and shape the young leaders of tomorrow through music. Yes, I was that intern, that overzealous intern that teachers talk about in the teacher's lounge because I thought that I could do it by myself. Guilty. That was me. After entering the classroom and working with students from various backgrounds, it finally sunk in. I can't change the lives of my students because I can't control their lives outside of the classroom. They sleep in class because they're up late at night taking care of their siblings while their parents are at work. They lash out against their teachers because they just witnessed their father being deported right before their very eyes. They hurt their peers because hurt people, and my students had seen their fair share of pain. It was in this moment that I became humbled because I recognized that their problems, their challenges, and their lived experiences were much larger than me. It was then that I learned patience. I recognized that if I was going to help them in any way, the best way that I could help them was starting with myself because you can't pour from an empty pitcher. I also recognized that if I was going to be the solution to their problems, I needed to understand why I was first and foremost part of the problem because I thought that I could do it alone. Being part of something much larger than me required me to perfectly situate myself in the struggle for social change and think critically about the ways I'm implementing the knowledge that I'm gaining along the way. The second thing that vision does is that vision shapes the future by requiring wisdom. A wise person once said, I think they were a philosopher if I remember correctly, it is better to be thought of as a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. And with that being said, I will not remove all doubt in my talk here tonight. Thank you. Just joking. Just kidding. The world that we wish to see tomorrow can only be created by our actions today. The things that we wish to see happen in our world, I've learned that through my lived experience, I've come to define wisdom as knowledge exercised. But more specifically, knowledge exercised appropriately. And I think it's important to mention appropriately because knowledge exercised in a vacuum serves no purpose outside of self-righteousness. As an educator, the most important thing that I've learned is that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. On my journey as a visionary, I've also learned that the understanding and implementation of vision can be found in the 5 W's of knowledge. Who will this knowledge impact? What is this knowledge? When will this knowledge be implemented? And this is critically important because it shapes how the knowledge will be perceived, but also how effective it will be. Where will this knowledge be implemented? And more specifically, what is your sphere of influence? And last but most certainly not least, why is this knowledge important? And why should it matter to others? And in most cases, my why is because people matter. So the last thing that vision does is vision brings people together by requiring a preference for the people. And there's no better way to show a preference for the people than to have a seat. So tonight, we're going to do just that. Let's have a seat. I've got some things to get off my chest. Now, before we begin this portion of my talk, I think it's important to provide a bit of a disclaimer. Now, while asking someone to have a seat may be quite an ableist statement, it is my hope that we're able to use the phrase metaphorically to shed light on the ways that we can combat power and privilege by leveraging empathy, personal relationships, and the human experience. Far too long has power and privilege run rampant in our lives, our communities, and in our world. Far too long have we valued the contributions of the marginalized while systematically dismissing their untethered existence and truth. Far too long have we stood proudly in our power and privilege without recognizing our positionality and the impact of our words, our actions, and our inactions. So tonight, I ask you to have a seat, and let's talk about power, privilege, and positionality. Has anyone ever been asked to have a seat or have several seats? Anyone? Truthfully, I have. According to the Urban Dictionary, have a seat is a pejorative phrase, meaning a phrase expressing contempt or disapproval, that calls for the person being asked to sit down to take a moment to consider what they've just said or done, or possibly examine their lives as a whole. Now, while asking somebody to have a seat may just be throwing a little bit of shade, I can hear my cousin saying now, a little shade ain't never hurt nobody. So with these things in mind, let's dig a little bit deeper to understand how we can use this phrase to combat power, privilege, and positionality. According to the English Oxford Dictionary, power is the capacity or ability to direct or influence the sequence of events or the behavior of another. Privilege is a special right or an immunity granted only to a particular person or group. Positionality is the fact or quality of being in relation to other things. When a person experiences the negative impact of their power and privilege for the first time, they go through a moment of crisis. According to Erickson, this is a psychosocial crisis or turning point that can only be resolved by balancing the internal self and the external environment. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability and shame gives us a great lens to explore this conflict. The internal self promotes shame, whereas the external environment promotes guilt. While guilt and shame sound synonymous, Brené Brown believes that shame is a focus on self and guilt is a focus on behavior. Guilt asks the individuals to sit in the experience of others and practice empathy, not sympathy. Sympathy is experiencing compassion, sorrow, or pity, whereas empathy asks us to stand in the shoes of another. Now, while sympathy is not inherently problematic, it is synonymous with the half-baked work of social justice that we far too long engaged in as a global community. So to provide a more clear illustration of the critical difference between empathy and sympathy, let's talk about the golden rule. The golden rule asks us to treat others how we want to be treated. Now, I would liken the golden rule to sympathy because it places you and your emotions at the center of the experience instead of evaluating the impact of those things on others. Empathy, my friends, is the platinum rule. And the platinum rule asks us to treat others how they want to be treated. Now, I would liken the platinum rule to sympathy because it requires that we listen and listen critically, not to respond, but to understand. It requires that we be courageous and that we are also vulnerable. And Brené Brown believes that vulnerability is our most accurate measurement of courage. I remember the moment when have a seat as a concept hit me square in the face. I was participating in a leadership development experience, and I was giving an Oscar-worthy reenactment of male privilege in society. Now, I thought that my acting was quite exquisite until I saw the facial expression of my fellow actress. She seemed hopeless and helpless and hurt. It was in that moment that I realized the true impact of my actions, acting or not. Walking away from the skit, I felt like a fresh, hot pile of insecure, toxic masculinity. The facilitator of the experience did a great job of trying to console me, but I asked them not to because I recognized that I needed to sit in this experience and feel the weight of this guilt. Because sitting in this uncomfortable place would require me to change my thoughts, my actions, and ultimately change my character. It would require me to let go of the power and privilege that I held on to so strongly as a man. It would require that I challenge the notion that my masculinity can only be defined by my strength, not realizing that the true strength came from staying seated and challenging that belief. Because if you're better able to understand and empathize with the experiences of the oppressed, then their problems become your challenges, and your challenges become our solutions and our visions. Our visions create the social justice and equity that we pride ourselves on as a global community. Our visions value people not for what they can produce, but simply because they were born in the lived experiences that they have up until this moment. Our visions value resistance because resistance creates growth, and anything not growing is dead. So tonight, I challenge you to have a seat and to stay there. I challenge you because having a seat is not a task for the weak and faint at heart. It is a task for the strong, for the wise, and for the powerful. Because having a seat does not make you strong, but staying seated does. Staying seated requires that you relinquish your power, accept your privilege, and adjust your positionality. It requires you to think critically about the moments that you failed and hurt others with the power and privileges that you hold. I have the great opportunity to work here at NYU Abu Dhabi, and my vision of world peace is one that I get to live out each and every day. The humbling realization that my most contribution of world peace are the students that I serve helps me to do the work that I do. Their ability to have critical conversations that foster conscious bridge building begins with the wisdom that I share with them today. But let's be clear, my vision of world peace is rooted in everyone's freedom, because in the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., if no one is free, if everyone is not free, then no one is free. I'm reminded of a poem often recited by my late grandfather, whom I lost a few days after my wedding last year. And the poem was written by the Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, 6th president of Morehouse College and spiritual and intellectual mentor to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I've only just a minute, only 60 seconds in it. Forced upon me, can't refuse it, didn't seek it, didn't choose it, but it's up to me to use it. I must suffer if I lose it, give an account if I abuse it, just a tiny little minute. But eternity is in it. If we've all been given just 1 minute to be the bold visionaries that our world needs most, my question to you tonight is, what will you do with your minute?